The North Carolinians that we're talking about are a brigade led by this guy. This is Isaac Avery. Isaac Avery, before the war, was a student at UNC Chapel Hill. He's a Tar Heel just like I am. And he actually worked for the railroad for a short period of time. When the war began, he became a colonel in the North Carolina Infantry. He commanded the 6th North Carolina Infantry Regiment. But here at Gettysburg, he's going to be promoted above the regimental level, and he's going to command an entire brigade made up of 1,400 North Carolina troops. On July 2nd, his brigade is ordered to break the line on Cemetery Hill. They're going to drive up Cemetery Hill and try to take the entire hill from the Union Army. He's going to have his 1,400 North Carolinians, and off to his right would be another brigade of Louisianans. The Louisiana Tigers are going to make the assault with them. All of this fighting is going on in the darkness, beginning sometime around 8 p.m. in the evening of July 2nd. This is probably one of the more chaotic and confusing moments of the battle because these men are trying to assault this giant hill in the darkness. This is a painting. This is the best thing I think that illustrates what happened there. Even some of the writing is tough to understand because the men were so confused on where they were at in the darkness. But this painting, I think, shows you guys a good idea of what was going on there on East Cemetery Hill. The fight developed into hand-to-hand combat because those North Carolinians were able to get on top of the hill with their Louisiana counterparts, and they got in hand-to-hand combat. But for the most part, they're not able to sweep Cemetery Hill of the Union soldiers that held it. In the fighting, Isaac Avery, who decided to ride his horse right at the end, right before the assault began, he's actually been shot through the neck while atop his horse. It was so dark and so chaotic that his men that are marching on the battlefield don't realize that he's been hit. His horse was actually wounded at the exact same moment. So they're going to be shot down together. He's pinned beneath his horse, and he decides to take out a pencil and paper and write a note to one of his subordinates. He's writing his note to a guy named Major Tate, who commands the 6th North Carolina. He's writing the note with his left hand because he's paralyzed on the right side. He's pinned beneath his horse, and he writes a note saying, "Major, tell my father I died with my face to the enemy." Those are his last words that he manages to write on paper. They find this note covered in his own blood. Now, his men that have made this assault that has ultimately failed, they're interesting in their own right as a brigade. The brigade consists of the 6th North Carolina Infantry Regiment, the 21st North Carolina Infantry Regiment, and the 57th North Carolina Infantry Regiment. Can anybody tell me, how do the regiments get their numbers?
Time that they enlist or the time?
That's exactly right. So the time that they enlist. So a unit like the 1st North Carolina, that's going to be the first 1,000 men to make it to Raleigh to enlist. Then the 2nd and the 3rd. So if you think about it, men like the 6th North Carolina, they've enlisted fairly early in the war. But on the other hand, they're marching right next to the 57th North Carolina that enlisted much later in late 1862. Now, what would be some of the differences between those men that enlisted early and men that enlisted later? So they're veterans and non-veterans, so we've got varied combat experience. What about their age? What about who they are? What their connections back home are? Men that enlist very early in 1861 and early 1862, a lot of them are very young. They don't have wives, they don't have kids. They're the young guys that want to go into combat as quickly as possible. They're very gung-ho about getting into the fight. The 57th North Carolina, on the other hand, they're made up of a lot of older guys that have wives, they have kids at home, they've got a lot more family connections. Both of those units fought very, very hard. All total, Isaac Avery's men, they're going to have about 50% casualties in the darkness of July 2nd of 1863. But they're not able to take Cemetery Hill, and of course, without having taken Cemetery Hill, that is going to lead to fighting that takes place on July 3rd of 1863. This is actually the next North Carolinian that we're going to talk about. You might know who this is?
John Gibbon.
That's exactly right. This is John Gibbon. John Gibbon, of course, commands a division in the Union Army at Gettysburg. But believe it or not, he's from North Carolina. He was born in Philadelphia, but at the age of 11, he moves down to North Carolina. When he moves down to North Carolina, he is eventually going to go to West Point. He's going to graduate from West Point in 1847. If you look at his West Point paperwork, he listed his home as Charlotte, North Carolina. So we have to consider him a Southerner, right? Right? Well, if you're not convinced yet, take for consideration the fact that he had two brothers to join the Confederate Army, because they were there in North Carolina. They're going to be joining the 28th North Carolina Infantry. He's the best man in D.H. Hill's wedding. Of course, D.H. Hill is a general in the Confederate Army, so he has lots of ties to the South. But when the war begins, he decides to remain with his allegiance. He decides to continue his allegiance with the United States Army. He's at first going to command artillery, but later he's going to be given an entire division of infantry. And his division, of course, is located where at Gettysburg? Does anybody know Gibbon's history?
Cemetery Ridge.
He's right there on Cemetery Ridge. John Gibbon was at ground zero for Pickett's charge on July 3rd of 1863. And in fact, on the night of July 2nd, he had a meeting with George Gordon Meade at the Council of War. Meade sat down with Gibbon, and he told him that if there's going to be an attack on the Union line, it's going to be on your sector of the line, John. So John is very much prepared for his attack that comes his way on July 3rd of 1863. Now, if John had managed to look up above the stone wall along Cemetery Ridge, or look at some of the battle flags that were involved in Pickett's charge, he would have seen North Carolinians headed his way on July 3rd, because that's going to include the brigades of Pettigrew and the brigades of Lane. Those are both full North Carolina brigades, as well as part of Davis's brigade, which has a North Carolina regiment in it as well. He, of course, is going to be involved in the heavy fighting that ensues there during Pickett's charge, but his men are going to be the ones to really hold the line on July 3rd, and they're going to repulse Pickett's charge. And you guys probably know the result of that. The Confederates managed to take about 5,000 casualties on July 3rd in that assault. Here's a full breakdown of some of the statistics when it comes to North Carolina and Gettysburg. Again, Robert E. Lee has 75,000 men, about 14,000 of them are North Carolinians. The Confederate Army takes 28,000 casualties throughout the entire battle. Of those, about 5,700 of them are from the state of North Carolina. Now, have you guys been to the North Carolina Monument out on Seminary Ridge? Have you read the tablet that stands just in front of it? There's a statistic on the tablet that says what?
Quarter of all casualties.
Quarter of all Confederate casualties are from the state of North Carolina. Now, when the monument was created, that was actually true, because we thought that there were about 20,000 casualties in the Confederate Army, but we think now that it's closer to 28,000 all total. So the monument isn't exactly right, but nevertheless it communicates the point. About 20% of all Confederate casualties at Gettysburg come from the state of North Carolina. After the Battle of Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee realizes the North Carolinians are fighting very hard. The men from other states recognize what the North Carolinians have done at Gettysburg. However, their identity and their reputation as a whole begins to change as 1864 wears on and on. North Carolina is actually going to have the highest desertion rate of any state in the Confederacy in 1864. Why might the men be deserting? What's that?
They're tired, they want to go home.
They're tired and they want to go home. That's exactly right. Exactly right. What's going on in the South in 1864? Sherman, Petersburg's going on, so we got a siege of Petersburg in Virginia, and then Sherman is cutting through Georgia, South Carolina, and eventually North Carolina. North Carolina women began to write their husbands and their sons in the field, and they beg them to come home because they're afraid that Sherman is going to do exactly what he's done to Georgia and South Carolina. So men are going to begin to leave Robert E. Lee's army in droves throughout 1864. So their reputation or their identity really begins to suffer through 1864. Eventually, the Civil War is going to come to an end in 1865. Now, most of you probably have heard of the surrender at Appomattox, Virginia, where Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. Well, there's two major armies in the East at this point. There's Robert E. Lee's army that surrenders in Virginia, and then there is, of course, Joe Johnston's army that surrenders in Durham, North Carolina on April 26, 1865. Johnston actually surrendered about 95,000 Confederate soldiers all total there in North Carolina. This is what's really going to end the Civil War effectively is the surrender that takes place on April 26th there in North Carolina. So despite having this deteriorating reputation in 1864, the memory of Confederate soldiers, or North Carolina soldiers in the Confederate Army, is going to be one of extreme sacrifice. And the projector, unfortunately, has cut off part of this. But the saying goes, and you could find these little logos, these Tar Heel logos after the war, all across the South. What the saying goes is that North Carolina, with a male population of 115,000, furnished some 127,000 Confederate soldiers and lost 40,000 of them all total throughout the war. According to the statistics after the war, that's double the loss of any other state across the South, with 5,000 men to spare. They're also going to be remembered to be the first to fight at Bethel, the first land battle of the war, foremost at Gettysburg, furthest at Chickamauga, and the last at Appomattox. And Robert E. Lee was quoted to say, "God bless North Carolina," in the aftermath of the war. That concludes the formal part of our program. Do you guys have any questions at all? Sure.
In comparison to the other southern states for male population, was just North Carolina the most populous for male population, or?
No, not necessarily. The highlight on that is the proportion between the male population and the number of men. So there's other states. Virginia had way more white males ready for military age than North Carolina did. But the argument is that Virginia didn't supply all of their men plus 10,000, as North Carolina does according to the statistics. Does that make sense?
How many people served from the South in total?
All total? I believe, and don't quote me on this because the statistics are very confusing, I've always heard 1 million, all total across the South. But of course, that's not all at once because men are wounded and replaced over time. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah, the Home Guard is constructed by locality. It's another really tough statistic to track down because a lot of the Home Guard were irregular units that didn't keep a ton of paperwork. But the Home Guard's role is to guard, the homes themselves, but also to track down those deserters of 1864. That's what they're most notorious for doing in the state of North Carolina. A lot of that's portrayed in Cold Mountain, the movie. Yeah. I've never seen a statistical analysis because of the lack of paperwork for a unit like that. Sure.
Being a Yankee, could you comment a little bit about where Tar Heel comes from? Is it,
that's a great question.
The pine tree harvesting? Or?
Yeah, it started out as a derogatory term because the main export early on when North Carolina's a colony are the naval stores. So that things like the pine tar, they're harvesting the tar to use in naval ships. So it starts out as a derogatory term. The Virginians are thumbing their noses at these dirty North Carolinians that work in pine tar. But then sometime around the American Revolution is the earliest that I've ever seen it used as a congratulatory term, and that's because the North Carolinians were said to have sticked on the battlefield as if they had tar under their heel. So they weren't going to run off from the British soldiers. So that's the earliest that I've ever seen is the American Revolution for it being used as praise. Yeah.
You mentioned the population in 1860. That was based in the United States census.
Yes.
And I assume that another census took place in 1870.
Yeah.
I know with some of the Civil War statistics, when they did a real in-depth census study, they determined that they probably underestimated the casualties of the Civil War.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you happen to know what the 1870 census showed for North Carolina?
I do not. That's a good point, though. I should look into that. Yeah, sure.
Thinking about, General Lee's order about no pillaging.
Yeah.
During the Battle of Gettysburg.
Yeah.
I know there were some, obviously, from some states, but I'm wondering, okay, North Carolina, do you know the statistics of how many, what soldiers did do the pillaging?
Yeah.
And I was just wondering.
I think my understanding of it was widespread. He issues that order, but we get, you find any letters, men are going to report it, they're not going to report it.